Last week, I took to BGA's Reel and asked you all, the audience, if you'd like me to do one of my trademark, in-depth, informative, educational, and entertaining analyses on the character of Amber Bennett, specifically her 2021 animated incarnation, as well as take a deeper look at her relationship with the titular Invincible Mark Grayson. The response was positively overwhelming, with many of you having very passionately misdirected feelings about Amber, going so far as to call her every derogatory name in the book. In the same video, I posed the question of if the naysayers would still feel as strongly as they did if Amber remained white like the original graphic novel. "It's got nothing to do with race," said a few poor, misguided, and uninformed souls. When yes, it's got everything to do with race, which ultimately influenced the drastically different personalities of both Ambers, which in turn shaped our perspective reception of each Amber for better or for worse. That said, for today's analysis, I'm going to apply my knowledge of psychology and sociology, as well as my experiences as a published writer currently working on a screenplay, to explain why the disdain for Amber's 2021 incarnation is ultimately misplaced and yes, is influenced strongly by racism, sexism, and misogynoir, or a hatred of black women. In order to do this thoroughly and objectively, let's establish a couple of caveats for how this video is going to work. First, I'll be examining both versions of Amber from the graphic novels, of which I spent the past week binge reading, as well as her animated adaptation. The next rule is that I'll only be examining Mark and Amber's relationship up until the point of where season 1 ended, which ultimately covers issues 1 through 24. Mad respect for the production team behind the animated series, because there is so much that happens in the comics that we don't see, or was either changed completely for the animated adaptation. Plus, a lot of the events in the graphic novel happen completely out of order in the animated adaptation. Lastly, I'll be breaking down why I call all of the hatred for 2021's Amber misplaced. All that said, let's look at Amber as a person as well as her relationship with Mark in the graphic novel. Aside from being portrayed as your stereotypical white teenage suburbanite, Amber doesn't even make her first appearance until issue 8, and when she does, it's just randomly out of the blue. She slips Mark her phone number as opposed to needing to be rescued by some sexist jock who clearly needs therapy. In issue 9, the two set up a study date that Mark does not get called away from to save the world. In fact, it goes so well that it leads to the steamy makeout session we get in the animated series, complete with Eve seeing them and flying away off in angst. By issue 10, the two are established as an official couple. It's also important to note that issue 13 is where episode 8, the final episode of season 1, concludes. In issue 14, we see the results of Mark's fight with his father, Omni-Man. At this point, not only has Amber still not figured out that Mark is invincible, but she also doesn't even question him. It's literally not a point of contention in their relationship. Once Mark is released from the hospital, Amber is overjoyed to see him. However, by issue 15, Amber starts to really notice how abnormally busy Mark has a habit of being. In issue 16, following the alien attack that left the city and their school decimated, Amber confronts him, asking why he'd even need a beeper before apologizing for questioning him while he's still trying to recover from the death of his father. In issue 17, Mark shows up to their graduation sporting a black eye, to which he lies and says he got it because he was mugged. Y'all, by issue 18, Amber is fully convinced that Mark is a drug dealer. She even goes so far as to confide in Eve and William, who literally laugh in her face. In issue 19 is when we see the fight with Battle Beast, which is significantly more toned down in the graphic novel. Mark unintentionally stands Amber up for dinner as a result. However, Amber is incredibly forgiving once she believes Mark was hit by a car. A lot happens in issue 20, starting off with Mark's mother asking if Mark is serious about Amber, to which he hesitantly replies that he is. In the same issue, William tries to convince Mark to tell Amber the truth about his secret identity. Amber comes to visit Mark at his new university, where it's attacked by those same abominations to both humanity and nature that we saw in the animated series. The scene plays out almost identically to the animated adaptation, with Amber nearly being killed before realizing Mark is nowhere in sight, but Invincible is. And it needs to be said, at this point, Amber still has not made the connection that Mark and Invincible are one and the same. For the first time in the series, Amber really goes off on Mark for not being there and storms off, refusing to take his calls or even see him for 2 whole weeks. We don't see any progression between the two until issue 22, when Mark eventually goes to Amber's college. He sneaks into her 3rd-story dorm room hoping to explain things. Just as he's about to, he's called away once more and Amber watches her man jump out of the window. This is shocking not only because it's the 3rd floor, but because there's no fire escape access. In the same issue, Amber confides in her friend that she believes Mark is a drug dealer, or even an alien, which is totally not untrue. Amber's friend jokes that Mark is invincible, and that's when Amber figures it all out. Yeah, to say the graphic novel versions of Amber is a bit late on the uptake is just me really being considerate. Later, Mark once again sneaks into Amber's room while she's sleeping. She wakes up and calmly confronts him, asking if he's invincible. Mark confirms that he is, and Amber takes the news incredibly well. Like, there's no confrontation about Mark lying to her or an important discussion on why Mark chose not to tell her anything for almost half a year. Amber's just hyped AF over the fact that her boyfriend is a superhero and accepts it without really examining the implications of what dating a superhero might be. It goes goes so well, in fact, that at the beginning of issue 23, Mark and Amber have sex for the first time. Everything is perfectly fine between them. Amber in the graphic novel is such a different person from her animated adaptation, shown time and time again to initially not even second guess Mark, even though he's constantly standing her up without explanation. As I mentioned before, the biggest difference with Amber in the graphic novel is her reception to the information that Mark is invincible. Amber's character is almost disappointingly very one-dimensional. She's certainly a likable enough character, but up until a certain point in the comics, she's equivalent to a superficial doormat with very little skill of observation for what's going on around her. For contrast, let's take a look at what changed when Amber's character was adapted into animated form. What needs to be said is that most of the drastic character changes that occurred from the comic into its animated adaptation happened with the women, with the exception of Adam Eve, who more or less retained her core personality from the graphic novel. And yes, I will say that those changes were definitely a major improvement from the source material's, well, let's say outdated tropes surrounding the portrayal of women in comics. For starters, Amber is portrayed as a black, intelligent social activist who isn't afraid to stand up for herself and think for herself. What frustrates me mostly about the reception to this version of Amber is how people have claimed she's, quote, not a real black girl because she lives a comfortable life in the suburbs and isn't an accurate portrayal of black girls, to which I say, some of y'all are not accustomed to seeing black women, femmes, and non-men portrayed not living in the hood with overwhelming trauma, or y'all have very limited social circles to have not encountered at least one black girl like Amber, and it really shows. It's also a complete and total failure on the part of mainstream media, but more on that in a bit. Speaking as someone who was born and raised on the violent south side of Chicago their entire life before moving to the suburbs for high school, I can in fact attest to the fact that there are black girls like Amber who live their entire lives in the suburbs, surrounded and supported and encouraged by their family and friends and community to thrive confidently without trauma. They do exist and they are valid as fuck. What we're not about to do is gatekeep black women, femmes, and non-men's blackness because you don't believe Amber isn't black enough from her experiences, her intellect, or how she speaks or carries herself. You can't have that argument and still say it's not about race just because it makes you uncomfortable. I've also seen the argument that Amber is just a black version of her white graphic novel counterpart. As I mentioned previously, these two are almost completely different people. That said, let's examine Amber in the animated adaptation as both a person and in proximity to her relationship with Mark. One of the key differences in between the progression of events and the time that occur over the course of the comic in contrast to the animated adaptation, a lot was cut so that Mark and Amber's relationship in the animated adaptation is more fleshed out, but it's also painfully obvious, especially in contrast to the comic, that their animated relationship was set up to fail from the start. In episode 1, as opposed to simply handing Mark a note and saying, hey, call me, Amber is introduced as being saved, who in turn winds up saving Mark. What I love is that Amber doesn't fawn all over him for literally doing the right thing. She simply thanks him and goes about her business, a perfectly acceptable response, and conveys that she never needed Mark's assistance in the first place. She can handle herself, but she does thank him for risking her life like that. Just like Debbie said she wouldn't give Omni-Man the time of day because he was a dick to her. In episode 2, Amber begins taking an interest in Mark, and we can already see that Amber knows something is different about him. She's proactive in getting to know Mark by first asking around to the people in his circle, i.e. William and then Eve. She rejects William's offer to accept Mark's number, going in a rather roundabout way to give Mark her number through Todd, which, I mean, was way more entertaining than the comic book version of events, but this also establishes Amber as an unfuckwithable character. In episode 3, Mark calls Amber. What's so interesting to note is that their conversation almost immediately jumps to how Mark is terrified of someone like Amber, which, you know, frustrating, because like, why are you terrified of the confident black girl who knows how to stand up for herself? Mark sure as shit ain't scared of Eve's confidence. I don't know. I don't like the message that sends, but more on the writing later. As we later see in the episode, things already start going downhill when Mark and Amber set up a study date. Unlike in the comics, Mark is called away to do superhero things, and Amber understandably gets upset by being left in his house for the first time for hours on end with no explanation, especially when he told her he'd be right back. The two make up and make out, which is witnessed by Eve. Episode 4 gives us Mark and Amber's first official date. It goes so well they agree to a second date. Mark is then called away for a space mission. Mark returns, but Amber is highly suspicious of the, well, suspicious lack of details about his trip. In episode 4, Amber gets frustrated with Mark for yet again being late, but chooses to forgive him. It's during this episode that Mark is invited to dinner to meet Amber's family after 3 months of dating. Mark shows up 2 hours late due to his whole superhero thing, and Amber is validly furious with him, explaining that not communicating with her is wrong and she doesn't want to put up with it. At this point, it's obvious that Amber realizes that Mark is invincible. What she's waiting for is Mark to tell her himself. And yes, you can't argue that it's a secret identity, and 3 months of knowing someone wouldn't initially entitle someone to knowing about that type of potentially life-threatening information. However, Mark continued to say that he wanted to build something serious with Amber and continuously built up that intimacy between them, but even when she gave him multiple opportunities to do so, he still refused to tell her. At that point, Mark should have just left her alone. He wanted to have his cake and eat it too, expecting Amber to just be fine with constantly being stood up and ditched with no solid explanation as to why. This culminates in Mark agreeing to assist Amber at the community center, which, as we all know, did not happen because Mark was busy having a superhero name put to the test by Battle Beast. Eve explains to Amber that Mark truly does love her and that he's serious about her. It's with this often overlooked line that Eve confirms something she said to Mark earlier, that if he wasn't serious about her, to not tell Amber. But as Eve confirms, Mark is serious, so Amber should have known before now. Episode 6, Mark gets out of the hospital and goes to see Amber. She explains that she'd practically broken up with him over that night, but the two agree to start again before once again making out and making up. Later, Mark and Amber go up to meet William's boyfriend at the university, and it's here that we see exactly how serious Mark is about Amber when he proposes attending the same university together. And I just want to point out how a lot of y'all are coming down on Amber for wanting to be told within 3 months that Mark is invincible, but y'all are also conveniently overlooking the fact that Mark himself proposed a whole future with her after 3 or 4 months. This would have been the perfect time to mention he's invincible, but he does not. The university is attacked, and the same sequence of events ultimately plays out the same way they did in the comic. Amber goes off and storms off. The difference being Amber instead goes to a party where she admits she isn't sure if she's with Mark anymore. Episode 7, Mike finally reveals to Amber that he's invincible, and what happens next is what a lot of fans say the turning point for their opinion of Amber was, when Amber tells him that she's known for weeks he's invincible and understandably gets upset that Mark wouldn't have figured that out already. Interestingly enough, the same dynamic is currently being played out through Omni-Man and Debbie's storyline. Both father and son share that one fatal flaw. They don't think the women in their lives are smart enough to figure them out, and when they do, they expect to be forgiven and things to return to happily ever after, as seen in the comic, with Amber's reaction to Mark confirming her suspicions of being invincible was rewarded by having sex with him. Amber's anger in the animated adaptation is more believable and realistic. Was she totally justified at times? No, but Mark did her wrong, and this is further confirmed by Eve, who comes down on Mark hard for stringing Amber along for 5 months. But no, Amber expressing her valid anger just got her labeled as yet another angry black girl. I'm sorry, tell me again how it's not about race. Lastly, in episode 8, Amber watches Mark's fight with Omni-Man in horror. Following Mark's release from the hospital, Amber goes to Mark's house grateful to see him alive, and the two get back together again. This is yet another point of contention for the Amber haters because it seems like she was just running back to him just because. She literally watched someone she loved almost die after parting with them in a very not pleasant way. I can speak from personal experience when I say the last conversation you want to have with someone you may never see again is one held in anger. We often see this trope portrayed in mainstream media. Person A will get into a fight with person B. Person B almost dies in a tragic accident. Person A immediately rushes to person B's side, realizing they'd almost lost one another for good, and agree that their love outweighs their problem. Amber's response is a perfectly believable reaction. She had plenty of time to rethink what it meant to date a superhero after seeing it firsthand, and only after, upon examining her own feelings as well as the implications of dating a hero, did Amber make the conscious decision to be with Mark. No different than the actions and decisions Debbie made in her decision to be with Omni-Man before she realized her husband is literally the worst person ever. Moreover, and I cannot stress this enough, even though she pretty much wound up doing it, we need to stop expecting Amber to handle the situation like an adult would. Mark is getting all kinds of passes for this because it's easier to see him as a teenager put into an adult situation. And I cannot stress how often we see this portrayed in mainstream media as well as real life, where little black girls, femmes, and non-men are seen and expected to be so much older than they are. And this isn't me reaching, this is real life, and it spills over consistently into the media we consume. Now, to the reason I call all of the hate in Amber misdirected. At the end of the day, Amber is still a fictional character. She was created by a team of writers. If you're going to be angry with anyone, be angry at the writers for writing Amber in not the best way possible and making her just yet another black girl character for people to unjustly hate on. And again, I say this as a writer, not to drag anyone, but to call attention to what is going on behind the scenes. As a writer, I would absolutely want someone to call me on my bullshit if I ever portrayed a black character, especially black girls, women or femmes, and non-men, in a way that the reception to that character is unbridled hate. If that is the response you're getting, you're either doing something right or you're doing it very wrong. With Amber, it's a mixed result. I would love to see a picture of the writer's room. I want to see how many black minds, especially black women, went into the reimagining of Amber's character for the animated adaptation. And I say that, but part of me already feels like I have a very clear image of what the writer's room looks like and why I cannot stress that we desperately need more open-minded black writers, especially women, femmes, and non-men, artists and animators with their hands on projects that involve any portrayal of us. Otherwise, this will keep happening, and no matter who's writing who, we'll never get a black character that properly represents us in the best way possible. impossible. But what do you all think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, follow me at Attack, and subscribe to Black Girls Anime for more in-depth, informative, educational, and entertaining analyses and reviews of your favorite anime, manga, video games, comics, and more, all for the culture.